So we have a great panel here today and a great follow to the conversation that happened at lunch, where really the major themes of climate change and the transition came up. We have Santiago Seage with Atlantic Yield, which is a big investor in renewable energy and has major projects around the world, in Europe and North America in particular. Mary Powell, CEO of Green Mountain Power, who from Vermont, who is one of the monopoly electricity provider in Vermont, and 90% GHG free in Vermont. Manuel Pulgar-Vidal is head of WWF International, a major, as you all know, I'm sure, World Wildlife Fund is a major environmental organization, big presence here in Canada and around the world on issues around climate change. And Paul Browning from Mitsubishi Hitachi Systems, which has got a wide range of applications in the energy world, and we'll be really interested to hear from Paul on where that's headed, because he's got his finger very much on the pulse of both traditional energy applications and where it's heading for the future. So we're going to start with a bit of an introduction from each of you in terms of what your company, what your organization, where you fit in the energy transition, and where you're making a difference at this point.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. In Atlantica, what we do is sustainable infrastructure. As we heard before, climate has changed, and we believe that one of the ways to contribute to a solution is to develop and invest in sustainable infrastructure. We are a company managing around $10 billion in assets, listed in the US and with a fairly global presence. What we do specifically is we invest both in sustainable power and in water. Within power, most of our investments are in renewable energy and in what we call the enablers of renewable energy. That meaning transmission lines. Obviously, renewable energy needs more and better transmission. Storage, power storage and energy storage, and natural gas as a transition that we will need for a certain time. That's what we do, develop and invest in that kind of assets internationally.
Very good, thank you very much. Mary?
Yeah, hi, it's wonderful to be here. I'm Mary Powell, as introduced, the CEO of Green Mountain Power in Vermont. I would say the way we are contributing the most in the context of climate change and the fact that the planet is indeed on fire and we need to move faster than ever to a different future. I would say that our biggest contribution, because we are a monopoly in Vermont, is really igniting the imagination of others around us of how we can transform economically to a low-carbon, cost-effective, reliable future. And what we're really focused on is innovating and really being an energy transformation company. Is how we think of ourselves. We actually haven't called ourselves a utility in quite a few years on the inside of our company. We think of ourselves as an energy transformation company that's obsessed with customers and obsessed with accelerating a consumer-led revolution in rural America to distributed resources, and really moving to a community, home, and business-based energy system based on renewable energy, and moving the bulk power system from the primary to the backup system. So a lot more there to unpack, but I would say as an intro, that's good enough.
Great, Mary, thank you. Manuel?
Thank you, Shawn, and thank you for you and to the organizer for inviting me. So we are working in implementing Paris Agreement. In this panel, we are talking about energy transition. And when we talk about energy transition, we should know towards where exactly. And that is related to the 1.5 trajectory, carbon neutrality. And for sure, the energy sector has done a lot, but it is not enough, still enough. So how can we continue transitioning, and how can we overpass limits and obstacles that we are looking when we think about energy transition. It is something in which we are strongly working on. And to do that, what we are working, it is mostly in trying to support and help countries to enhance NDCs, these climate plans or national determined contribution, because we know that the plans that the countries put on table in 2014 or 2015 are not enough. With that, we could raise temperature toward 4 degrees. And we are looking for a 1.5 trajectory. So we do need to double our effort. And that is why the UNSG summit in some days, September the 23rd, and we are strongly working on that. But also what it is important, and we are pushing a lot, it is to have long-term strategies. The only way to move towards an energy transition, it is by having a clear vision of where we want to be in 2050. If not, it's going to be very difficult. And also, it is the way in which or through which we could overpass the current political difficulties that we are facing in the world, not only in the US, Brazil, among some other places in the world, with deniers, political deniers, are creating some obstacles. The point it is that if we can keep a long-term strategy, we could really move that energy transition towards our objective.
Paul?
Thank you, and glad to be part of this esteemed panel, especially because some of them are potential customers of mine. So, you know, in our industry, we have asset owners who are financial entities or utilities, and then we have companies like Mitsubishi that are the technology providers. What we've been doing for over 100 years is developing the next generation of technologies, but either through inventing or commercializing it, that our customers need to accomplish whatever their goals are. Right now, our customers across the world have a very high focus on decarbonization of the power grid. And so one of the things we're very focused on is developing and commercializing the technologies that our customers are going to need to continue the path of decarbonization. So that can, in some cases, that can be a customer that wants to switch from coal to a very efficient natural gas and get a 65% reduction in their CO2 emissions. In other cases, it's a customer that wants to buy a renewable power project, and we have a business that does that. We've sold carbon capture and sequestration technology. We actually have a project in Houston that's capturing 90% of the CO2 emissions from a coal-fired power plant and sequestering it underground. We're developing lithium-ion battery storage products and selling those. We're also, we just announced that we're developing the world's largest renewable energy storage project in near Salt Lake City in Utah using renewable hydrogen. We have a nuclear business. We have a 50-50 joint venture in offshore wind with Vestas. And so, you know, we're one of those companies that if there's something happening in the power industry, we want to be there in the role of the technology provider.
Very good. So as we get the sense from the panel, there's a lot happening, and we've heard over the last morning and at lunch just all the various things going on. But Manuel mentioned the gap, right? There is a huge gap between, at this point, the ambition, or at least the announced activity and funding of that transition and the imperative. So I'd be interested in each of you giving a sense of what are the most important elements to accelerating action and making sure that we close that gap. So let's start with you, Paul, coming down the other end.
You know, one thing I would say as the technology company, we're hoping that what the politicians do is not select specific technologies. You know, what we're hoping is that the goals they set are zero carbon emissions, and that we have a complete freedom to act in how we deliver the technologies that will allow our customers to achieve that goal, rather than setting goals like 100% renewables, which, you know, as I just said, we have a renewables business. We're very much focused on that, but we also think there's other solutions that, and we don't want to over-constrain a very, very difficult problem. The other thing I would just say is we really have to recognize that the vast majority of the people in the world who use electricity are poor, and the challenge here is not just to come up with zero carbon solutions. The challenge is to come up with a transition to zero carbon that works financially for the poorest people in our world.
Manuel.
Yes, 4 ideas. Last year, 2018, emissions related to global energy grew around 2%, less than 2%, but close to 2%, after 3 years of a flat position. And most of that grew, it was related to coal. So coal, it is still playing a role in global energy. And we do know that we must phase out coal, but unfortunately, it is still growing. So there are many things that we should address when we talk about coal. So that is the first reality. The second one, it is something, a personal experience that I had in Mexico the last week, in City of Mexico. I had a good meeting with investors of clean energy, and as you probably know, Mexico canceled the fourth renewable energy auction that they had planned before. And you know why? It was mostly because the political intention of the president of strengthening Pemex, the fossil fuel company. So that is something that the low carbon technology, it is currently facing. Political decision that it is still pushing traditional fossil fuels. And we should have some ways to address those kind of things. And that is related to something that Paul mentioned, the role of natural gas. We know that natural gas, it is a transition source of energy. But we do need to know that the science has already told to us that by 2050, 75 to 80% of global energy should come from clean technology, from low carbon technology. So that is the third element. And the fourth element, it is that probably sometimes we are looking renewable energy just as a supplier, but not all the package. When we think about a carbon neutral economy, we should include buildings, cities, transport, carbon storage, and many of what it should be the energy package. So for me, those are 4 elements that we should take into consideration.
Very good. Mary.
Wonderful thoughts. It reminds me of a line I love that somebody said when you were speaking, Paul, of, you know, the challenge here is to balance the fears of those who fear the end of the planet with the fears of those who end the fear of the end of the month. And, you know, I think actually, you know, what's fascinating to me is that this actually can be done, in my mind, this transition, this massive global transition in a way that is incredibly affordable. The technologies actually exist. I love what you said about technologies. My frustration is the technologies actually exist. I think that really what, you know, the biggest thing I focus on is the greatest force, I think, in the economy, which is the force of consumers. I actually think more than anything else, we actually need to have in place ways to excite and ignite consumerism, because I really believe, and I'm starting to see some shifts that get me excited around whether it's sustainability around in the fashion industry and people starting to question themselves on, I don't know if folks in this room know this, but the average American actually wears items they buy on average 3 times. 3 times.
I'm above that average.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. Well, I will say, yeah, I will say that doesn't surprise me from a gender perspective. There's also statistics on the role that women play in that number. But you know, I think just as much as that's a devastating number on the context of what that means from a global warming perspective, what is really exciting to me is that there are, and it's not just the millennials, it's not just the younger folks. There are increasingly bodies of consumers that are starting to really care. And so on the energy side, you know, the transitions that we're getting to lead now with our customers, when I say we're an energy transformation company, it's not just, we're 90% carbon free. We are going to get to 100% renewable. We do believe in that difference, and we're excited about that. We're about 60 some odd percent now. We're going to hit 100% by 2030. But the exciting work we're getting to do with customers in Vermont now, and the excitement I'm starting to see around transitions, is around transportation. I mean, we are bundling energy for customers around transportation, around heating. So we really see ourselves as an all energy transformation company. And so I really think at the end of the day, it is about exciting people to make transitions to technologies that exist that actually, if done right, can be very affordable.
Very good. Santiago?
Yeah, I will also, I would like to be optimistic regarding this. I do agree that the revolution has happened already. So many people talk about renewable energies being something in the future. No, it has already happened. Renewable energy is the cheapest form of power generation in many, many geographies. Talking about the Western world, but talking about the developing countries as well. When you look at power prices of recent renewable energy projects, you're looking at 2 cents per kilowatt hour in the US, yes, including some tax advantages, but you're seeing 3 cents per kilowatt hour in many, many regions. That's much cheaper than anything else. It's much cheaper than coal, it's much cheaper than gas, it's much cheaper than nuclear, it's much cheaper than anything you can think of. Now, that revolution has happened. The revolution that's coming is many people are still saying, yes, but renewable energy is not dispatchable. Well, it is true, not every renewable energy is dispatchable, but there are some forms of renewable energy that are dispatchable, and the storage is the next frontier that is happening. And those who have been like us in the business for many years, we recognize that storage is going to go through hiccups. There will be perhaps expectations too optimistic regarding storage, but eventually, in 10 years, storage will allow all of us to have real, dispatchable, clean, affordable power, both in a distributed fashion and in a central generation fashion. So one, the technology is there, as Mary said, with a very low cost, even if some people continue using numbers from 10 or 20 years ago. Two, I don't know nearly any administration in any country, in any province, in any state, who does not want to do something good for their consumers or citizens, looking at developed countries again, or looking at poor countries. So that changing mentality, Mary was talking about consumers, when you look at regulators, when you look at administrations, has happened already. It is very difficult today to say, no, I don't want a cleaner generation. And third, financing. The fact that we have very low interest rates has pros and cons. In our industry, it's a blessing because we can invest huge amounts of money putting together private capital, public capital, money coming from banks, and we need to leverage the fact that for the next few years, it looks like interest rates are going to be low to really run in that race. So I am optimistic. The tools are there. The will is there. Of course, we need time. In the power sector, nothing has ever happened in a few years. So we need a bit of time.
Great. Go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to, the one thing I would add to that is, from a technology point of view, what we think is the biggest technical challenge is storage. And you know, when your grid goes from 0 to 15% renewables penetration, the intermittency it's okay because the rest of the grid can sort of tolerate that. When you go to 15 to 30%, it starts to get tougher. If you want to go 30% and higher, unless you've got a lot of hydro as part of your system or pumped storage, if you don't have that blessing, then it gets really tough to go beyond 30% because you start getting into, you need longer duration storage. The short duration stuff today is actually getting to be pretty affordable. It's the longer duration storage, when you have to store energy for days or weeks or seasons, that is really tough. And as you get to higher and higher renewable penetration, those challenges become bigger and bigger. So one of the reasons that we're focused right now on renewable hydrogen in this project that we have in Utah is it's an opportunity in a very affordable way to put long-term storage in place, and we reuse our gas turbines that were designed to burn natural gas, and instead we burn hydrogen in them. So it's also a spinning asset, which is important in terms of frequency regulation and that sort of thing. So I really think in terms of what's the big to-do in order to get to 100% or zero carbon power, it's that long duration storage part of the challenge.
Good. Manuel, you wanted to?
Yes, I want to make a couple of comments related to Santiago's two words, revolution and time. And the first one, it is true, renewable has developed a strong revolution in relation to technology and prices, and that's completely true. But again, the package of energy, it is not in the same revolution. So for example, energy efficiency, the cooling has grown dramatically, but 2/3 of that growing, it is not efficient. So we should continue working in energy efficiency, and that is strongly related, for example, to buildings and cities. So the need to develop a sustainable cities agenda, it is a key element to fit with that revolution. And also I have a comment about the time, because we have time constraints. We know that we are not on track, so how much more time we can take to bend the curve. Because if not, we are going to have, as the science has told to us, overshoots. And with an overshoot, it's going to be more expensive and more difficult to bend that curve later. So the point is, how can we develop this energy package? I think that is the point now. It is not about renewable. Nobody has doubts about what renewable has done. But the point, it is in relation with many sectors that should address the energy challenges.
Right. Thank
And
you.
that's
Go
just
ahead,
to add
Mary.
to that,
Yeah.
I mean, again, for rural America, or for rural anywhere, I think, I just want to put a point on, storage does work, actually. It exists. We are actually, we were the first in New England, in the New England ISO, to dispatch storage devices into the market and get credit for it. So we have had days in Vermont where, hot sunny days, where the cost of energy is high and it's laden with carbon, where we have literally saved the Vermonters we serve $750,000 in 1 hour because we're dispatching actually distributed small resources. To your point, I hear you, but I actually think it could be missing the point of the consumer-led revolution in rural America, because then you really are moving to a highly distributed environment where if you pair your solar and your storage and your EV, and you have that in a way that you can orchestrate it with the grid, we actually have some of the highest penetration of solar of any state in the country. We're right behind Hawaii, and we found that we can do it very effectively by building a community-minded approach to energy, much like we do in some parts of the country. We certainly have it in Vermont, where we have a community-minded sense around food and other aspects. So I think the technologies are there. They work today. We were the first utility in America to deploy the Tesla Powerwalls. We now have thousands in Vermonters' homes. And the cool thing, when you think about a grid that is a distributed grid versus the existing one, is it is so much more resilient and ready for climate-related effects. Because the problem is we can't just plan for trying to bend back the curve. We've got to plan for how do we provide greater resilience to people now. Because the reality is the next decades upon decades, we're going to have very disruptive weather, no matter how quickly we bend back the curve. So that is another thing of thinking about how do we do this in a way, again, especially in rural parts of our economies, that can be more affordable, more resilient, and the resources and technologies work, and they're there now.
A point I wanted to make and have you comment on is we're talking about energy a lot here, mostly, and you've broadened it a little bit. Mostly we're talking about electricity. Obviously, electricity is a big part of the story, but it's only a part of the story. So how do we extend this conversation beyond electricity and talk about decarbonizing transportation, decarbonizing buildings, which is where a lot of the really, I think, probably harder slog is in terms of long-term decarbonization of the economy?
It's interesting. Once again, the technical challenge is storage, right? And lithium-ion batteries are working today very well in passenger car kind of applications, Tesla kind of applications. But as you get to things like long-haul trucking, And those kind of applications, the lithium-ion battery is likely not going to be the solution, and it's going to be something like hydrogen or other renewable fuels. So, or biofuels, or those sorts of things. So, but it really, again, the principal challenge there is solving the storage problem. And so our view is this is all going to be interconnected, and it's at the end of the day, it's all going to come back to electric power, because it's going to be decarbonized electric power that's going to charge the batteries or make the hydrogen or whatever your storage medium is. That's where we're headed.
And I think, going back to your question, Manuel mentioned it already, energy efficiency should be the low-hanging fruit. And it has been the low-hanging fruit for many years. And still, the solutions in place to tackle that, the solutions in place to really make sure that every building is more energy efficient, it's not happening nearly anywhere. And that's where probably the equivalent of what has happened in power generation with renewable energy still needs to be invented. I'm not talking technology. Technologies are fairly obvious. I'm talking how to invest money, how to force owners, what regulators, administrations need to do to make sure that we do reduce energy consumption through efficiency. And then going back to storage, well, I totally agree that that's the next challenge. I'm more optimistic than Paul. Yesterday night in Arizona, we own a solar plant in Arizona. As you know, it's not the coldest place on Earth, and air conditioning consumption probably doesn't make any sense, but it is what it is. Yesterday at 11 p.m. at night, our solar plant was delivering 200 megawatts into the grid. I'm not saying it can be done everywhere. I'm not saying it's a standard solution, but there are many technologies today that can deliver already storage solutions. Now, I totally agree with Paul. It's the challenge. We need to improve it. And it's where I believe what we saw 20 years ago, 15 years ago with wind generation, what we saw 5, 10 years ago with solar panels is going to come with storage, and it's going to completely transform our sector, both power, but also transportation. Because at the end of the day, transportation either is going to be power or it's going to be something close to power, like hydrogen.
Well, no, just to add to that, I mean, again, I love that, I think it was a New York Times piece, but just, really the only solution is electrify everything, right? And so that's why it is important, in my view, that we move as rapidly as possible to, zero carbon or low carbon energy supply. But the other thing I was reflecting on in your question is, at least again, I can speak from my experience working with consumers in Vermont, and we are in many ways ahead of others in the context of the energy revolution. And in many ways, I think the interesting thing about energy and about engaging on energy, and again, we engaged on energy efficiency starting about 25 years ago. So we have that backbone culturally, and culture does eat strategy. But it is many ways, energy is the gateway drug into the imagination of other kinds of energy transformation. So what we've seen is customers who go solar or who go with storage are then faster adopters of an electric vehicle, and they're faster adopters of heat pump technology that runs much more effectively and efficiently. So in many ways, I think the importance of it and the importance of distributed technologies is again, as much about exciting the imagination of consumers and creating that first step towards then other transformations that they feel more comfortable taking.
Very good. Taking a step back from something that would excite the imagination of consumers, talk about CCS and about, I assume that was one of the technologies you were thinking about when you talked about the difference between a zero carbon and 100% renewable. So what role for fossil fuels in the future, and how do you mitigate them cost effectively?
Yeah, so CCS in North America has had some pretty tough outcomes We have the one project, and I'm not saying this to brag, it's just the truth. We have the one project in North America that finished on budget, on schedule. It's the Petronova project that NRG had in Houston. We capture 90% of the CO2 emissions from a 250 megawatt coal-fired power plant. We ship it, I think it's 60 kilometers in a pipeline, and we use it in enhanced oil recovery to produce oil. ERCOT's a competitive market, so this is not something that's being subsidized by a utility. In a competitive market, if oil's at about $50 or $60 a barrel, this pencils out for our customer. It's a good return on investment. When oil's $40 a barrel, it doesn't work so well. When oil's $100 a barrel, they're feeling great. It all comes down to what can you do with that CO2 and how do you get economic value from it. So unfortunately, that's a great solution in Houston, where they've got great geology for CCS and everybody knows what's under the ground. In a lot of other places of the world, you just don't have the right geology for carbon capture and sequestration. And the thing we have to be really concerned about, and getting back to Manuel's comment about we need to get rid of coal-fired power generation, we've just built hundreds of gigawatts of brand new coal-fired power generation in Asia, and they don't have great geology for carbon capture. And so you have to do something else with that. You have to utilize that CO2 some other way.
And there has been a lot of, I don't know if this is outside the wheelhouse here, but there has been a lot of work around utilization of carbon and great efforts to find commercial uses for carbon dioxide other than shooting it down an oil well and using it for enhanced oil recovery. But I don't think we're there yet, and certainly not at the level of magnitude that would be required. Manuel, do you have a view on the future of fossil fuels?
Let me answer, Shawn, your question with one phrase of the 1.5 IPCC report. In a 1.5 trajectory, the use of CCS would allow electricity generation share of gas by 8%. So it is interesting and also it is interesting what it is happening today in Norway, that the Europeans are discussing the role of CCS. But the main message, it is not related to CCS, but mostly to clean technology and mostly to discuss how much policy is related to elimination of subsidies to fossil fuels, carbon prices, what kind of role that kind of policies could play in this energy transition.
And you talked about gas as a transition. What kind of transition are we talking about here? Is it a long transition, short transition? I've read that some of the companies in terms of gas turbines are actually seeing sales way below what they expected. Is that because of competition from renewables, or where are we in terms of the dash to gas, as it was called?
So I'm one of those companies. So
yeah, I know.
There's three big producers of gas turbine combined cycle power plants. It's us, GE, and Siemens. We just had our best year ever. GE did not, and Siemens is sort of somewhere in between. But we have seen a reduction in the total megawatts that are sold versus prior years. A lot of that is because there's competition with other forms of technology, probably the most significant of which is renewable power. Some of it, though, is more just sort of cyclical. Some of the big markets around the world they built a lot of gas recently, and they've slowed down as they sort of swallow all that new capacity. So anyway, some of it's secular, some of it's cyclical. But to me, the answer for gas is that the gas turbines we're producing today are capable of burning 30% renewable hydrogen. And in the next few years, we're going to be capable of burning 100% renewable hydrogen. So we have a lot of customers that still have a lot of coal to retire and that are going to replace it with a combination of natural gas, renewables, and storage. We have other customers, like in California, they've pretty much already retired all their coal. And so for them to continue down the decarbonization path, they have to go after natural gas, and we're going to go after it with renewable hydrogen, at least, and renewables. Yeah.
So I will give a different answer, and you need to remember that Powell manufactures turbines. So natural gas will be done when power storage succeeds. And when is that going to happen? Very difficult to tell. Is it going to take 10 years for power storage to be really affordable in long periods of storage, as Paul was saying before? Is it going to take 15 years, 20 years? I don't know, but within that time frame, I don't see a need for natural gas turbines anymore. And that's my point of view. Where you disagree, Paul, obviously.
Even if they're burning hydrogen, right?
Another area that frankly doesn't get in these kinds of panels, I think, much attention, and that is nuclear. And what role for nuclear in a low carbon, zero carbon world. Most of the IPCC reports suggest a pretty healthy role for nuclear, I believe. But I'd like to get views on that, especially from Vermont, where I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you've retired one and another one is being retired?
We had one, and
Yeah.
it's being shut down.
Yeah.
You know, I would say in the U.S., my view is we're not going to see new nuclear. So it really becomes the question on how do we leverage the existing nuclear assets that we have. And when we launched our green energy vision, you know, over a decade ago to get to a low carbon, low cost, incredibly reliable future, we absolutely wanted to leverage nuclear as a part of that. And in fact, we still do. When the Vermont Yankee nuclear plant was shut down, we negotiated a deal with Seabrook in New Hampshire to be the bridge to help us get to this, you know, to get to our 2030 goal, which is 100% renewable, and obviously then 100% carbon free. So yeah, I think where they're safe and can be operated, they should be operated as long as they can possibly last as a backbone to the transition, for sure. I also really I really agree with you on your view of storage. I think part of what we're also maybe missing a little bit so far is the view of actually at least what's just happening in the United States of America, which is there is already massive defection from the grid. And it's not just individual consumers that want solar and storage, or it's not just, you know, the view people say, oh, it's high end. Nope, you know what? Even in Vermont, we have literally thousands of commercial customers who have gone to self-supply. You know, across America, the trends are stunning of the commercial and industrial customers and consumers that are moving towards self-supply. So I think particularly as storage advances and it allows that angle to accelerate, it's going to create incredible disruption for those in the fossil business. And you know, as we all know, the informed folks in the fossil business are making tons of investment actually in a pivot towards renewables, towards really engaging in business products and services that are even direct to consumer. So I think to me, sometimes on my days when I'm down, I think of the fact that, you know, Shell and others are investing really big in the pivot because they see the end of their existing business model, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, it's happening.
Manuel.
I don't want to make a statement about nuclear, but to link the nuclear with what it is the concept of energy security. When we talk about energy security, we are talking of the concept of energy security. It is the most affordable source of energy for a functioning economy. And it is interesting because it is not related to climate consideration. And what it is happening in the world, it is that the world, every country is taking decisions based on their own concept of energy security and a lack of integration. So look, when Germany decided to phase out nuclear, they grew in lignite, no? And now they have decided that probably around 2038 they will phase out lignite. That for many people probably it would be too late, no? When France decided to also phase out nuke, finally they decided to postpone because nobody followed them. So the concept of energy security and integration of system, it is something that we should address as a way to avoid that kind of erratic decision that many countries of the world are taking.
To what degree, that's been a big topic in Canada, a big sort of theme that I've been aware of, and that's the fact that the electricity industry, until very recently, has been state-owned and still is in a lot of countries and provinces, for that matter, in Canada and states, and it's treated differently than a lot of market-based industries. So, To what degree does that sense of energy security and the need to, not just energy security, but good jobs in Vermont by Green Mountain Power, or good jobs in New Brunswick by New Brunswick Power, how does that affect this whole need to transition and to make the most sustainable choices regardless of jurisdiction?
I mean, I believe that what you're talking about is about the past. And what I mean by that is, yes, obviously the model has been the one you described. Now, if you look globally, obviously, if you look at California, in California, what Mary mentioned of consumers leaving the utilities, it's not that it has happened. It's that there are entire communities that left the utility and have created their own mini, it's not a utility, mini whatever, mini generator. And that trend that is very, very clear in the US, in Europe, for example, it's different. In Europe, what you see is new players, new companies selling power to consumers. And those new companies are not utilities. They don't have the legacy, they don't have the large assets, they don't have the thousands of employees, and they are offering more affordable, cleaner power to consumers. So there's a revolution happening there in many shapes and forms. And the only thing I believe I know is that 10, 20 years down the road, it won't be 99% of the market with utilities who own the clients and who don't need to worry about competition. It will be about all sorts of forms and shapes of companies offering different forms and shapes of power.
What does that do to the legacy costs of utilities as you have people leaving the grid and in many cases still wanting the backup of the grid, but not wanting to pay the freight, and so people are left. Those who are left on the grid, do they not face rising legacy costs?
Absolutely. I mean, that's to me, that's the business case starting, over a decade ago that most utilities should have been thinking about, so. And again, I think that many have. Our whole approach has been, again, we're customer obsessed. We want to lead the revolution. So it's been about partnering on innovation and bringing innovative solutions to be a part of that future, to be a part of accelerating that future. So in some ways, you would see accelerating almost the demise of the existing model. But again, if you look at other industries and other disruption we've had, those who succeed are the ones who embrace disruption and say, how can I be a part of this new and very different future for the customers we serve? It will be interesting to see how it plays out with strategic electrification, though, because as you have that happening, you also have, the only way to really meet some of the carbon goals around transportation and heating right now is electrification. So that also could be, if done well, that provides an awesome opportunity especially for if I were looking in kind of state-owned, that again, if you take an innovative approach, my gosh, you should be able to do it really affordably and innovatively for those that you serve. But the challenge is that there is, decades of wax buildup in the I was going to say in the minds, and that's probably not fair. In the infrastructure, in the culture, that makes change very, very difficult.
Talk to me about cost and consumer. I mean, you all about the consumer, but for all of you, we're sitting here in Ontario. It wasn't that long ago, a couple years ago, and it's where rising electricity costs were a huge political issue. Created huge political backlash, fairly or unfairly, largely unfairly, but with some degree of justification, was blamed on the shift from coal to renewables, essentially, and large power purchase contracts that were worth a lot of money. But there was a lot else going on as well, including refurbishment of nuclear plants. So how does the consumer fit in here? Are you, obviously, Mary, you're very confident that the consumers can be brought along, and in fact even lead in some cases, but you're also, as I read, facing some challenges with rate increases in New Hampshire. So how do you balance that out? I'm sorry, Vermont.
Vermont, yeah. So, yeah, no, and you're right. Any increase is challenging for consumers. And actually, you know, we currently had a 2.9% increase. We've had years where we provided decreases to consumers. Since we launched this vision, we had 4 years where we provided bill decreases to Vermonters, actually, and now we needed a 2.9% increase, and it upset some, right? That'll always happen, and you've always got to be aware of that, but the reality is we provide now energy that is the second lowest overall rate of our New England peers. So, you know, again, we are in New England, which is a higher cost part of the United States of America from an energy perspective, and that dates back to decisions made for decades and decades and decades. But we are second lowest overall, which we believe, and we're 90% carbon free, headed towards 100% renewable. So what we're finding is, you know, it's interesting when you were saying you thought the question was like, living in the past, because it's always what's so interesting when you're trying to innovate and change and be part of what you see as the future solution, because we have just as many businesses in Vermont that say, oh my gosh, you know, this is why I want to be here, because of your portfolio that you provide and because it is so cost effective against the rest of New England. And you'll have very much the traditional businesses that have been there for decades and decades, that are just saying the same old thing. They actually have said to us, we don't care, we'll take the dirtiest power possible, we just want it cheap, right? So you're always gonna get that. You're always gonna get that. And when you're customer obsessed, as I like to say, you have to be obsessive about what your customers want, and you gotta go with what the majority want. And the vast majority want the transition we're doing, and it has been very, very cost effective by any way that you would measure it.
Manuel, would you agree? Paul, you go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it's customer driven, and then it's also voter driven, right?
Yes.
And I lived in California when we had rolling blackouts, and we impeached our governor and put Arnold Schwarzenegger into office. And you know, I was with a customer in Algeria once who, the prior summer, our power plant was late in going online, and people lit his office on fire. You know, when governments screw up power, you get a change in government. Yep. I mean, and I've seen it happen in different parts of the world. So, and screwing up power means different things to different people, right? I mean, there's a lot of people right now who say, if you're not headed towards 0% carbon, you're screwing up power. There's other people who say, you know, if my rates go through the roof, you're screwing up power. The other big thing is if your grid becomes unreliable and you start having blackouts and your power is unreliable, you've screwed up power. So you've got all those different constituencies that you've got who all, at least in a democracy, can vote, and even not in a democracy can light your office on fire and do things like that. You've got to keep them all sort of, you know, all those different parties happy, which means that you're usually looking for some medium space in there that, you know, that gets you reelected, or in the case of consumer-driven behavior, that keeps your consumers coming to you instead of going to somebody else.
And while you talked about greater ambition and encouraging people to come to the UN later this month with greater ambition, how does that cost, which really translates into political support at the very basic level, again, whether people vote or not, political support is really crucial. So how do you talk about that with the government leaders that you talk to about the same time they need to have greater ambition?
Yeah, the topic of ambition, it is a very challenging one, because we know that we should implement Paris Agreement and that we are doing things. As Santiago mentioned, we are in some way and in some cases in some revolution, but what we have done, it is not enough. So the point it is, how can we scale up most of our action that includes not only energy, but also land, forest, food, among some other sectors. And we know that the only way to get into a carbon neutral economy by 2050, it is by half emission every decade. That is what it is called the carbon law. And when we talk about that kind of challenges and coming back to the cost and this consumer driven or voter driven, there are three elements to consider, not only consumer, but just transition, that it is about jobs and incentives. because it is very difficult to talk about cost if we keep subsidies to fossil fuels, if we are not able to put an accurate price to carbon and to have carbon taxes. And that is what is not working well. We hope that by developing what is called the Article 6, that it is about market and non-market mechanism, that I hope that we could achieve by this COP25 in Santiago, the carbon market could be more dynamic and can help and could help to really address the energy challenges. So it is not just about consumers, but jobs and also how to define clear incentives.
And let me perhaps, going to your question, Shawn, use Ontario as an example, and I'm going to share a couple of numbers. Some of them might not be accurate, but if I'm not wrong, hydro and nuclear in Ontario, the cost is around 8 cents per kilowatt hour. And as Ontario was a pioneer in renewable energy, it did sign a number of PPAs at whatever, 150 or in this case 15 cents per kilowatt hour or 20. The reaction to that is that cost is high, that results in a higher average power cost, let's stop renewable energy. Now, from my humble point of view, that's a total mistake, because you were the pioneer, you paid the price of being the pioneer, and now that renewable energy can provide extremely low cost, you don't want to continue using it. Today in Ontario, my guess, without being an expert in Ontario at all, is you could sign wind and solar PPAs for 3 cents, 4 cents,
That's
3.5.
what they've been in Alberta.
Yes, and they've done it next door. And in the US, even lower. They have a better natural resource. So is it really a smart decision not to continue doing renewables because you signed in the past expensive PPAs?
You know, and just one comment, what the mistake people make all the time is looking backward at pricing instead of looking forward. You know, if you look at what we're selling today, it's very, very affordable. If you look at what we were selling 10 years ago, it looks very expensive. And so people want to look at the cost of what's already been installed. You have to look at the cost of the next megawatt or the next gigawatt.
So there has also been talk, and Mary, you were on a panel earlier about financing. And I think the time we have left, it would be good to talk about getting the capital into this sector that is required, because you know, we've been told it's a massive undertaking. It's a full retooling of the energy infrastructure essentially over the next 25 to 30 years, right? So where does that capital come from, and what are the barriers that could be removed to making sure that capital is deployed? Anybody jump in?
Just one quick comment I'll make. You know, most power projects have a 20 or 30 year pro forma, you know, that they use to justify the financing. So to have a complete turnover over a 30-year period is actually doable, you know. Something that a new coal-fired power plant that was just built yesterday, to retire that 30 years from now is you know, it's not the easiest thing in the world, but it's very conceivable. So to turn the whole thing over in 30 years, we can do it. I think, you know, from a financing point of view, one of the things we're looking at is, you know, sometimes when you're trying to do something new, the cost of money to do something new is higher than the cost of money to do something that everybody's done it 1,000 times. So onshore wind right now, very cheap money. PV solar, very cheap money. You want to do the world's first gigawatt scale hydrogen storage project, expensive money, right? So that's a place where I think governments can come in and help, you know, and not necessarily give us a subsidy or a grant, just do something to give the banks a guarantee that allows them to give a, you know, a cost of money that's more like a mature technology, so that we can get something done, scale it, and start bringing it down the cost curve. So anyway, I think, and you said earlier, you know, we're in a very low cost of money environment right now. The thing with renewables and a lot of clean energy technologies, because you don't have a fuel cost, the big cost is the upfront CapEx cost. And cheap money makes that upfront CapEx cost a lot easier. If we had 9%, 10% interest rates right now, a lot of projects that look really economic today with cheap money would look really uneconomic. And so that's a really important part of the whole equation, is getting a cost of money that works for the mature technologies and the newer technologies.
Good. Manuel?
Yes, I am not an expert in the financial sector, and probably you can help me to correct me if I am wrong, but what I can see it is that there are no clear alignment in between our objective in energy with the financial portfolio. And when we talk about climate finance, we are used to saying that we should achieve the 100 billion and the disclosure and those kind of things that are good, but for sure not enough. When we talk about 100 billion, that it is just a political signal. The IPCC has said to us, or has told us, that we do need for the energy transition 800 billion annually. So that is the real cost. So 100 billion, it is just peanuts. But to promote that alignment, what we do need to have, it is a clear vision, where are we planning to be in some time, strong policies, correct incentives, and that could align the financial sector or the financial portfolio towards a clean energy. But I think, and please correct me, that elements are not well aligned.
Very good. So let's finish then on that thought, and kind of from your previous panel where you had a one wish. We'll give you one more wish. What policy would you propose? One big policy idea that you think would have a significant impact on this transition in terms of accelerating and closing that gap between ambition and the imperative. Santiago.
In my case, putting a real cost on CO2 emissions everywhere. Today in Europe, there's a certain cost on emissions. Elsewhere, in reality, it didn't happen. And you need, most economies where we compete or where we work are based on numbers, financial returns. Put a real cost on emissions, and people will stop emitting, on top of the things we discussed today about consumers, regulators, etc.
Mary?
I would agree with that.
I mean the same, a clear carbon pricing system and policy.
Just to be a little different,
Please.
what I would say, I think about this all the time. I think a lot of people are looking to politicians and scientists to solve climate change, and they're not the ones who are going to solve climate change. It's going to be the people on this stage. It's going to be financial players and technical folks who are going to actually make it happen. Now, don't get me wrong, the politicians are very important to set sort of the right playing field, and the scientists are important to sort of point us in the right direction and help us figure out sort of how we're going to get there. But it's going to be financial investors and engineers that are going to really solve climate change. And so I think it's important that financial players need to make money, right? They need to make a profit in order to do what they do, and we have to not begrudge the fact that they want to make a profit. And on the engineering side of things, I think, again, giving us the freedom to be engineers. Don't over-constrain us. Let us solve the real problem, which is climate change, not some other problem.
All right. Well, with that, I think we will wrap it up. I want to thank the panel very much for, I think, a very engaging conversation, and the forum for inviting us.